Can I have your name and affiliation, please?
Riccardo Baldessone, Honorary Fellow of Berber College. I'd like to continue with your link the papers. To me, there's a clear thread passes through all the papers. And the thread is, as you said, is the complication or the dichotomy of metropole versus colony. But the complication comes, in my view, from a kind of creeping multiplicity. It's a double multiplicity. There's a multiplicity in the colony and a multiplicity in the metropole. And then the multiplicity in the colony is, for instance, what Alessandra was talking about. And it can be reconnected simply to the divide and rule. But probably we can do more with that. And I'm thinking also to the other multiplicity, the multiplicity in the metropole. It was hinted to by the paper by Sukanya, because it seemed to me that in order to understand the two positions, the claiming of Indian identity as Indo-European identity needs to link to European multiplicity, the construction of German identity, because this is the context in which the linguistical pop and the Indo-European hypothesis have been built. And this has clearly effects on Sanskrit, and the fact that Sanskrit has to be understood and especially the grammar of Apani as a descriptive grammar rather than a prescriptive one. So it's a complex interplay. It seems to me, and this double multiplicity could be read as an opportunity to think to alliances. They are not simply on the side of the dominant powers. It could be thought, in the case of India, as a kind of possible claim that could be think in terms of assimilation. But in the last paper, it was something more than that, the opportunity to open, to discover the inner otherness, the inner multiplicity. This seems to me the common thread. It's more a comment than a question.
Hi, I'm Hannah Kinsler. I have a question for Jack, and I was a little surprised that you decided, or I felt that there was a notable absence of the indigenous populations whose lives were affected by the settlers. And I would just like to know a little bit more why you decided to kind of ignore this and the violence that was exerted by the settlers that led to literally genocides on different continents, and how this would, by excluding this historical fact, you are creating an identity of the settler that excludes an important portion that I would think should be taken into consideration when kind of reassembling and dissecting this kind of an identity.
I think that's a very important question, and one that obviously I thought about very much in framing this. As I said in the beginning, I think my interest was in, like I said, moving beyond the givenness of the settler state, because what that involves is the idea that the settlers are the rightful claimants of the land. I was very interested in studying one aspect of that, which was how that discourse emerges. I am by no means suggesting that's the only aspect. What I hope to show is precisely how that discourse emerges in Western political thought, one that ultimately justifies exclusion. For me, one of the sinister aspects of this discourse is it is precisely that, one of exclusion, not one of replacement, or not one of accommodation. And one of the reasons why I think Wakefield is so important in this is the lack of attention he actually gives to indigenous politics itself. That shows just how sinister this discourse of inclusion actually is. If you read all of his works, there are literally 2 chapters in one book that deal with this problem. So my purpose today was to precisely show how this the logic of this discursive exclusion of indigenous politics works precisely so that we can move beyond a situation where we assume the givenness of national settler states' claims to territorial sovereignty.
Thank you. Anke Engel, Institute for Queer Theory in Berlin. I would like to add a further question on the same topic, because for me it was a little bit surprising that I like this distinction between the settler and the colonizer, but then somehow what I felt was lacking was kind of like the shift of the vulnerability and unreliability also to the position of the colonizer. And I would like to ask whether you could somehow maybe connect to Maida's talk in the end, where she was talking about kind of like these moments or possibilities of a post-sovereign subjectivity, which I think would be nice for your talk. And then maybe a second question, whether you could comment a little bit on the visual material, because somehow it provided for second narration in your talk, and I wasn't quite sure what's actually happening there in kind of like how is it re-establishing or even reinforcing the settler-colonizer distinction, or what was your implication with that?
Thank you. I think to deal with the first point, you're absolutely right, and I very much see my work as being part of a much larger whole within Occumeni that precisely explores what these questions are, the implications of the kind of issues I've been raising for understanding contemporary politics, contemporary political theory, contemporary European identities. So, for example, I think one of the things that was interesting with Wakefield is reveals the large extent to which white identities in this period are fractured, are ones that need to be deliberately constructed and developed. And I think the relationship with the colonizer is an interesting one. Like I said, it's one that I'd say a lot of my work explores. I started out as a historian of Britain and suddenly realised you can't write the history of Britain without exploring these topics. It's a journey I'm continuing to do, but I think, and I hope it's a journey that answers the kind of questions you're raising. Yeah, the second narrative with the pictures, I think if I'd had a longer paper, I would have explained a lot of them. Each one I picked because I think they're quite interesting in that they're contemporary, most of them. What they reveal is the extent to which pictures, much like Edward Gibbon Wakefield's narratives, are designed to create this narrative of space somehow being cleared, but somehow that being a kind of natural process, a gentle process. One of the things I found interesting about so many of the pictures I selected is the sense of harmony they convey when they're actually describing something which is the very opposite of harmony in so many ways, even down to simply pegging out some land, claiming it as your own, to have a kind of settled agriculture going on there. If I had more time, I'd love to explain some of the choices I made for that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dana, and I'm part of this project. I have two questions. One is for Jen. You spoke about the political subjectivity of the colonizer and more specifically the settler, and then quite at the end you added through a quote the consumer, and if you can elaborate more on how these things link consumer, colonizer, and settler. And the second one is for Maida. You spoke about inheriting and the responsibility, the task to change, and I think that inheriting, it's not only this pure European purity, but also the former otherness, which was part of the former construction of European self, and by this I mean the Jewish otherness. And I wonder if and how you link between former, and maybe not only former, European Jewish otherness and the Muslim otherness.
think there was someone else. Yes, gentlemen.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jason Fernandez, and I'm from the Institute with the University of Lisbon. I think the question speaks to most of the panel, but I'd like to start, and I'm making this up as I go along, so bear with me. I'd like to start out with Sukanya's reference to Muhammad Haq. And that kind of amused me, because he refers to the Romans as a bad example and the British as a good example. Because where I speak from, the Portuguese understanding, the Romans are actually the good example and the British are the bad example. Because it's the Romans who extend citizenship to persons outside of their race, right? And while the British Indians, and I just like to stress that we're speaking about de-orientalizing, it might also help us to identify when we speak of India, we really speak of a British India, and because there are multiple Indias, right? And I'll come to this point later on. Moving outside of this British Indian frame would perhaps allow us to see the multiple ways in which Orientalism was constituted and the way in which we can de-Orientalize, the multiple ways in which we can de-Orientalize. And then moving to Jack's presentation, you raised the dismissive manner in which Wakefield refers to the Celtic icon, to the Celtic French and something Irish, right? And I'd like to tie it up with Maida's presentation, is that if we are speaking about de-Orientalizing, perhaps we need to move away from a tendency to reconstitute Europe as a single, right? And look at the multiple Europes that exist within Europe. Because when we speak, let's say, as the non-Christian European other, at some level we are constituting Europe at the same time as Christian, and yet Europe is Protestant and Catholic, and the Irish Portuguese are not quite European. So maybe speaking from these, fracturing Europe at the same time as we attempt to de-Orientalize would be a helpful tool. I'll stop.
You're absolutely right about the issue of the Jewish otherness and the responsibility and the inheritance. It's not simply the Muslim immigrants now or the citizens, European Muslims I use. That's why it's important. We need to, if we are talking about the redefinition of Europe, refashioning of Europe, these people are not, it's not enough simply to talk about them as immigrants, refugees, or this. They are Muslim Europeans. They are European Muslims or whatever. So it's absolutely important. Perhaps I've started answering or agreeing with your point about that it's the multiple Europe that is in Europe is going to be refashioned by imagining these people as Europe as well, not simply counter-European or anti-European or anti-Christian Europe we need to fashion. But regarding the issue of the Jewish otherness, I think it is very central. The reason why I focus on the issue of Muslims is because this is now central in Europe's redefinition of itself. The issues of secularism, issues of religion. When we talk about religion today, we understand in Europe nothing but Islam and Muslims and the religion of fanaticism. But going back to history, rethinking Europe, one has to think that it was the internal enemy was the Jewish, and Ottoman, the Muslim, was the external enemy. At that period, Jewish was the emblem of religiosity, and Islam lacked all the theological qualifications. It was nothing but political. So I would like to refer to Gil Anitria's brilliant work, The Arab, the Jew, the Historical Constitution of the Enemy, where he sorts out how the Jewish was the internal enemy and the religious enemy, while Islam, lacking theological sophistication and qualification, was regarded as the political enemy. Islam was nothing but the name of being political. It was an excuse, religion was an excuse. The religion of Mohammedans was the name, was the religion, is an excuse for waging a political war on Europe. But with the Enlightenment, with the secularism, that is, secularism is nothing but Orientalism, as we know. And again, I will refer to Nietzsche. He says, Christianity is the only religion that has secularized itself. It's like this, he plays with this oxymoronic term. So when Christianity has invented secularism, when Christianity has secularized itself, Islam became the religious enemy. That political enemy disappeared and it has become religious. Now it's nothing but the name of a religious enemy. But then there's an interesting gestures going on, I think currently, with all the debates about laicite, secularism, and secular ways of life, Muslim people living religious lives, is the culturalization of religion. Islam is being now contested as the immigrant way of life. It's their culture that contradicts with the essential European values. So I will just conclude with referring to the Danish cartoons. It would not be possible in Europe now to have the same cartoons about Jewish people. No way. That will not be allowed at all. But if you examine historically, all the features of those cartoons, they're very, very similar to the portrayal of Jewish people when they represented the internal enemy. So that relationship is really important and interesting.
To deal with a really interesting point you made about the kind of fractured European identities, for me this has always been something that's interested me about the topics I've explored. As I said earlier, I actually began my work looking at English accounts of the Highlands of Scotland and how the Highlanders were presented as barbarous and incapable of improving the land and therefore not having title to it. And what amazed me is I literally saw the same tropes being used in British discussions of Adivasi and establishing indirect rule in Western India in the 19th century. For me, the kind of continuation of these kind of tropes, the way they reappear, and then eventually later in the 19th century somehow become a celebrating trope of some kind of national identity that kind of gets invented afterwards, really interests me. And this is precisely why I'm interested in these kind of foundational texts and the moments when these things are being put down as if they were always there, the moments in which these are being invented. To deal with the distinction, my use of the word colonist as well as settler, is that it? Consumer. Oh, did I use the word consumer? Customer. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is, what's key here is, for Wakefield, the main concern was that the colony provided wealth for the metropole. And there was a reciprocal trade. This was always what the debate was about in terms of the benefit of colonies in the 18th and 19th century, in Britain in particular. It was only in the 19th century that the debate generally concluded with the idea that colonies could be a good thing. And again, what was interesting to me here is the lack of importance Wakefield attaches to things like individual national identity, which is precisely why he put in that quote. What was important wasn't the fact that America had become an independent nation state, far more important that there was a community that you could trade with and develop wealth with. I think that's something I'd like to have developed a bit more, but my concern here was precisely those aspects of Wakefield's writings that have been given less attention, specifically the way in which he's worried about the settler as a carrier of European civilization, their vulnerability. But given a longer talk, I'd like to talk more about that.
Thank you. If you can keep your questions concise, we're running out of time. Yeah, just hang in there.
I heard all people resonating with one another, and I'm just trying to draw these resonances and articulate a question that's identical to each of you, but with a different inflection. I heard two modes of analysis at work in 4 papers. One mode, I would diagnostic mode, which I think Jack and Sukhanya's papers were in diagnostic mode, identifying the ways in which particular interlocking mechanisms of orientalization work themselves out in the colony. In the case of Jack, the diagnostic is about a more subtle differentiation between the settler and the colonizer, and how that difference might translate into a particular political subjectivity. In the case of Sukhanya, the interlocking mechanism of race, science, citizenship, and how that was conducive of and productive to a particular understanding of political subjectivity in India. And then I heard another mode in Ale and Media, and this was more affirmative mode. Affirmative in the sense that each is actually instigating a subversive reversal of politics. In Devi's situation, where writing, the act of writing becomes an articulation of an alternative, different political subjectivities, political subjectivity that is denied what it is claimed back, it is taken. There is this affirmative politics at the micro level, and in Media's affirmative politics as subversive reversal is that, well, you want to talk about a Europe? Let's talk about a Europe. What is Europe then? Well, let's talk about how do we inherit? What are the principles of inheritance? What is the articulation of inheritance? And it turns out that there is no pure Europe. There is no homogeneous Europe. It is itself stratified and differentiated, that it has always produced a form of otherness, and therefore the openness to that otherness, making the conversation continue, is a political project of Europe. It is a subversive reversal, drawing from there. Now, for each of you, though, my question is, what follows? Having made, in case of Jack and Sukhanya, having made the diagnostic, what follows? What follows as in both in your own work, but what implication one should draw? It's a bit invitation to think sort of the political implications of the diagnosis you have reached. Different for Ale and Media is not so much as what follows, but there are, everywhere you turn, there are mitigating forces and circumstances that force us to think that invitation is not accepted, that subversive reversal is either falling on deaf ears, or that it is not gaining the traction that one should really hope that it should. Instead, we see in Europe, in the UK as well, a massive internal closing that's taking place. Rather than participating in opening of Europe, there is an intensified singularization and homogenization of what Europe and its constituent parts mean. There's a closing. And similarly, with respect to relationship to responsibility to colonization, we see that the literature that succeeds in Europe today is the literature with invitation to think that European history had nothing to do with coloniality, that it actually cleansed itself off from coloniality by instituting different relationships to different parts of the world. So then, what follows? What's next? What implications that follow from this political situation we find ourselves?
My question is for Maida. I'm wondering how the Derridian notion of hospitality might be complicated in relation to Muslims when it's other immigrant groups who express Islamophobia. And I'm thinking more, I'm not as familiar with the European context, but in the Canadian context, some of the most virulent forms of Islamophobia have been from secular immigrant groups, Hindus, people who are trying to align themselves with the nation state by expressing Islamophobic sentiments. So then, doesn't it trouble this notion of who is the guest and who is the master of the house when it's one guest against another?
I can start if you don't want to. Well, first, Engin's point. Yes, you're absolutely right. It was a nice framework that you set between the diagnostic and the affirmative mode. But I would also add that in my paper, my diagnosis and my affirmative mode go hand in hand. The diagnosis of Europe cannot go without its affirmation or de-affirmation, unaffirmation, or whatever we want to call it. So I really want to insist on that because any destabilization, any subversive reversal of Europe has to come from within Europe. That's why instead of imagining a pure other that is located outside of Europe, the idea of Europe, I think for many years, the liberal multiculturalism has led us to imagine that kind of Puritan, pure notion of otherness. No, otherness is contaminated, as your example of the Indians in Canada being one of the most Islamophobic ones. So otherness is also contaminated. So there's no pure otherness. Any transformation of the imagination of Europe is with Europe, has to come with Europe itself, with the already existing ideas of Europe and Europeanness. So yes, there will be always mitigating forces, always circumstances that block all these political and ethical gestures of the transformation of Europe. But that's what history is about, isn't it? We cannot rely on the goodwill of the master. No, never. I mean, the master will always oppose to these kind of things. But that is the ethical and political past. That's why I would want to insist on the indissociable link between ethics and politics. Politics is not something that comes with a decree or there is no prescription for it. It's always an ongoing process. And it has to be, it cannot be designed as it's not a decree. So it has to be informed and enlightened always by a certain sort of ethics. So it's an unending process, and mitigating circumstances will always be there for us. So it's a very interesting and nice question, given that they are not the so-called owners, the others. How would we discuss? Yes, I mean, I don't want to make identical issues of racism with the conditional hospitality or conditional welcoming of the other. Racism and all sorts of othering and stereotypes about otherness and Islamophobia can come from various sorts of other groups. But is that relation, I mean, this is a question that I'm thinking out. I haven't really thought of that, actually. So it's, thank you for bringing that, and I will think about it further. Perhaps issues of hospitality and ownership, because there's a very specific issue about ownership of the home in the case of hospitality, maybe doesn't apply to those relationships. Those relationships have to be told and retold with the light of other concepts, perhaps. So we might not have to think hospitality as the most brilliant concept to think of everything, you know.
Thanks, Engin. And it's a question that distresses me a little. And I'll say why. I agree that there is affirmative mood, but there is also, in my case, I would say, an affirmative tone. And the reason of the affirmative tone is the critical relation of the text with the political situation and the need to speak up as social movements. My writing are related to specific, to what I would call, the political urgency. There is a situation, there is some, I talk about death, I talk about social discrimination, and there are social movements to which this writer is associated with, and there's that tone that is the tone of emergency, I think. And I think that is very productive. Like, working with that tone is a wake-up call. That's why I try to keep it in my writing, for example. But I agree with the association with Maida, because as she says, want to talk about Europe, let's talk about Europe. I say, want to talk about the nation state, let's talk about the nation state, and about the plurality and the imbalance that is written within the idea of citizenship. Now, the reason why the question distresses me a little is that I have two tendencies, and one would be just resisting the what follows, because on the one hand, the mere act of being here and reading certain texts and listening to certain texts is already, to me, part of the political action that I want to undertake. So I would say, even if I stop here, it's an achievement. It's the political goal that I wanted to achieve. Listening and reading is part of a political act, and that is, what my research on literature is about. And on the other hand, it is also true that I'm working within a project that's called Citizenship After Orientalism. So what follows is an interrogation on the idea of citizenship through this use of Orientalism that comes from texts that are not mine, that don't belong to me, and that questions me deeply and trouble me deeply. So I have these two things in hand, and that's why your question distresses me. But I'd say that in articulating them and in articulating these questions through listening to certain narratives, that is what follows for me. That is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Ingen. I think if we're interested in citizenship and challenging the sense, the extent to which it's a bounded concept, a concept that's only useful in the context of membership to an entity such as a nation, if that's something we want to challenge, also if we want to find different contexts for thinking about citizenship, then I think history has to be rewritten. I think lots of the histories that we have, that we rely on, are inadequate for this. And my topic today was that perhaps the history of the settler nation state is one that we have to try and look behind and beyond. I think only one really interesting example of that is precisely this idea that the settler nation state comes along and therefore claims sovereignty in a particular area, denying sovereignty to local indigenous populations, denying their ability to be individual nations, to have recognition as nations in the contemporary law of the time. Those peoples therefore have to are forced to become subjects of that settler state. That kind of process, I hope I've shown today, must be understood comparatively as much as it must also be understood nationally. So I suppose what happens next is the complete rewriting of history, or maybe something a bit more modest. But certainly I think the kinds of questions that we ask today do have historical implications and should force us to kind of rewrite or reframe the histories that we use.
Yeah, we could go on, but I'm sorry, that's all we have time for now. If you'd like to join us for lunch.